All right, so I think we're live right now. But yes, hi everyone. Hi everyone that is tuning in from YouTube. If you are here, hopefully you're here because you are interested in Asian Mental Health Project Survivor Support Summit. We're so happy to be able to relaunch our summit. Last year we weren't able to just because of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we are so happy to bring back our third annual summit this year. Amongst our amazing speakers, as well as artists, as well as our somatic healing facilitator earlier this morning as well, and also bringing this in along with our Asian Mental Health Project team and volunteers. So we are at the 1 p.m. PST, 4 p.m. EST session, focusing on breaking cycles of violence, how to prevent sexual violence. So for those who don't know me, my name is Tarm. I use she, her, they, them pronouns. I currently serve as the Director of Partnerships with Asian Mental Health Project. And yes, welcome to our Survivor Support Summit that focuses on education and advocacy around supporting survivors of sexual violence, as well as gender and power-based harm. And so this year's summit, we are so happy and so grateful to be in partnership with Every Voice Coalition that trains and mobilizes future generation student leaders to be able to create state laws addressing campus sexual violence. And so what we're going to go ahead and do now is that I'm going to go ahead and have the panelists, our lovely panelists, introduce themselves today. So let's go ahead and start off with Andrew. So since you're the first one that popped up, go ahead and start first, and then maybe let's go Bella and then Grace after. All right, floor is
Cool,
yours.
sure. Are we doing short intros or?
Yeah, well, let's do short intros first, and then we'll go into background in a bit.
All right. So hello, my name is Andrew. I use any and all pronouns. And yeah, currently I'm a violence prevention educator. I work in higher education, working with folks doing prevention education for anti-sexual violence, sexual harassment work on college campuses.
Yeah, okay, awesome. And then my name is Bella. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Communications at the Every Voice Coalition, and I also do environmental research.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grace Pinzafari. I use she, her pronouns, and I currently work at Stanford University as the Assistant Director, Education Outreach Manager for the Sexual Harassment, Assault, and Response and Education Office. I primarily do a lot of educational interventions for college students. I'm also a trauma-informed yoga teacher, and so I teach to survivors as part of their healing process and journeys. And I'm also a PhD candidate, and so very exciting. I'm hopefully going to be very close very soon, but my research topic and interests are around Asian American college women survivors and their experiences of sexual and relationship violence, but how that intersects with racism and sexism, and understanding how cultural wealth intersects with also how they heal too. I'm also a proud mom. I have a 1.5-year-old baby feminist. And so it definitely keeps me on my toes, but I'm so excited to be on this panel with all of you.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for your introductions. So let's go ahead and just kind of get into it. So we have a couple of questions that are set. I'm super excited for this discussion today. So let's go ahead and dive just a little bit deeper in terms of some of the work that y'all are involved with. So the first question is, please share about how you got into this work of supporting survivors, as well as engaging in survivor advocacy and activism. Bella, would you be open to starting first?
Sure, yeah. So as a survivor, I think I was not someone who immediately jumped into activism. It was quite honestly, and I think this resonates with a lot of people, something I just wanted to be far, far away from. But I think like many others, the COVID lockdown really put me in a space of introspection, specifically about being a survivor. And I kind of found myself wanting to learn more about the issue from an academic lens because that felt more digestible than thinking about my own experience. And ultimately that led me to policy work. So learning about different policies at the federal and state level, and then going in to do a fellowship with the Every Voice Coalition and learning more through the development lens, and then going through to help to write state policies, and now training other students to do the same. So that's a little winding journey of mine.
I can go next. So I got into this work during my undergrad. So I ended up joining a peer education program that really centered men's role in violence prevention. And through my time there, I really learned that I had like a huge passion for prevention education. And shortly after that, I started working in like the nonprofit sector. And shortly thereafter, I ended up realizing that higher education's a bubble. There's a lot of obvious like work towards supporting survivors at the margins, and that's not necessarily true in a lot of local organizations, unfortunately. And so, especially being a younger person right after undergrad, my voice wasn't necessarily taken as seriously. There's a lot of ageism in in the professional workplace. And so I was like, people aren't going to take me seriously until I go to grad school, get my MSW. And so, really pushed me to really try to do more education and do more work, specifically trying to, learn more about restorative justice practices and how to support survivor, support services, in prevention, and yeah, have like a more intersectional approach in advocacy and prevention work.
Thanks so much, Bella and Andrew. I'm so inspired by your paths. I just feel so honored to be in space with you. For me, how I got into survivor support and advocacy work is that I have firsthand experience of what it feels like to experience violence on multiple different levels, whether it be individual level from surviving relationship violence and sexual violence, and also collective harm perpetuated within our own Asian communities that are really rooted in a lot of historical and intergenerational trauma, and also patriarchal cultural norms, and also thinking about the societal violence such as racist misogyny that continues to happen again and again to Asian American women. Those are really my lived experiences. And so I got into this work because the personal is always political, right? And I often reflected about that, especially like Andrew going through undergrad and also graduate school too, and then starting to kind of make some meaning through what kind of Bella was sharing a little bit about, kind of reading those different texts and trying to understand and name my own experiences within this understanding of this broader structure of systemic oppression, right? And so some things that were really kind of resonant with me was really thinking about the lived experiences that we walk through is really knowledge. I get this understanding from, I always have some books handy and I always like to share some books, but this is The Bridge Called My Back. And this book was really transformational for my own journey and understanding my own lived experiences as knowledge. And so that is really what fuels my work. And that's how I started to kind of support survivors and really thinking about how survivors have so much strength and so much power. And it's really my privilege to be able to kind of come and just uplift survivor voices. And so I'm always living and kind of breathing and kind of thinking and orienting from the survivor experience and thinking about how do we actually center those survivor narratives.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for your introductions. Oh, I always feel so inspired whenever these sessions go on, just because I also feel like, when it comes to this work of supporting survivors, it's a super niche. It's like a super niche area to work in. Well, first of all, right. And then not only that, to be able to extend supporting survivors in different disciplines in a way, in terms of policy work, in terms of research within higher education and all these different spheres. And so I'm so happy with just the range of all of you and just where you come from and your background and your expertise. And I also just want to say thank you so much for engaging in this type of work. I feel like it's hard work, it's vulnerable work, and sometimes I just feel or even a lot of the times there isn't enough gratitude and just saying thank you. So from the bottom of my heart, as well on behalf of Asian Mental Health Project, we're just so honored to be amongst all of you today. And we're so honored to be in community and to do this work alongside all of you. So let's go ahead and jump into the next question. So there's a lot of talk about how violence is a mental health issue. How do we see cycles of violence actually be broken down from an individual and perhaps a systemic level? So I'm going to go ahead and just open up to the floor, and whoever would like to begin first can go first.
I think we're all too polite. We want to let each other speak. but I can jump in if anybody wants to kick us off. Yeah. So when we're thinking about breaking cycles of violence at the systemic level, coming from this policy lens, the first thing that might pop up would be federal legislation, right? So one that frequently comes into conversation would be Title IX, which was originally pushed by Congresswoman Patsy Mink, the first Asian American woman to serve in Congress. So gotta put that little tidbit in there. But in the 80s, Title IX, just to give a little background, was expanded to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex in educational institutions, then extended again or expanded again to prohibit sexual harassment and violence. And then in recent years, both unfortunately contracted and then expanded and then contested and contracted to reinstate and extend protections to all survivors, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. So for the systemic level, that's one law that we can think about, which is great at a federal level to give us a baseline of rules and requirements. But as we know, the demographics and needs of communities and institutions vary greatly state by state and then local communities, which is why we like to focus on state legislation and tackling that cycle of violence through both prevention and response measures, because you need both to not only create that awareness, but start answering questions and creating a framework to answer questions about, what is sexual violence? What can it look like? A lot of us don't know how to identify that. Don't know when it's happening. And then even in retrospect, for me personally, it was hard for me to identify. And then what resources do different communities need, and what partnerships can we enter into to create a space where student survivors are fully supported, if and when violence occurs. And so writing these into policies also spurs on individual conversations about what can be done. What does it look to thrive as opposed to just survive post-violence? And then how can we dispel some myths or misconceptions about campus sexual violence or sexual violence as a whole when we start to put those policies and put them into a public sphere of conversation?
I can jump in. Thank you so much, Bella, for kicking us off and thinking about the systemic level. I always love to orient around the systemic level because when we think about our violent outcomes that we see, these are not individual level issues. This was an intentional system that was systematically and intentionally created to produce violent outcomes for particular groups, right? And so when I think about how this is a systemic issue, then we need to think about ways to subvert this and take agency back on a systemic level, right? And so some things that I think about and trying to break cycles of violence is really trying to model what an abolitionist mentality is, where essentially we are so trained to be thinking in a very specific format, right? From K through 12, higher education, we are understanding that we need to be kind of abiding by certain rules to be able to kind of quote unquote survive in the society, right? And so some things that I have been thinking about when it comes to kind of breaking cycles of violence on a systemic level is to be able to dream beyond what the systems have told us that we're capable of, right? And so when I think about breaking cycles of violence, I think about tangibly how we are socialized in so many ways that we have to be operating in a very kind of Western capitalistic format, right? Where we are made to feel that anything that we are doing, we need to be producing to be able to create value to others and certainly not ourselves, right? And so something that's kind of like a tangible takeaway that I've been thinking about to break cycles of violence is really absorbing this mentality of how radical rest is the form of resistance. And again, I like to mention another resource. And so this one is Rest is Resistance, a manifesto by Tricia Hershey, who's the founder of the NAP ministry. Tricia calls us to really think about how we are constantly in this grind culture, that we're sleep deprived and we're longing for liberation, and yet we just are too tired, right? And when we are wanting to actually disrupt and push against capitalism and white supremacy, our bodies are really the site for liberation. And NAPS, as what Tricia says, is really a portal to imagine, invent, and heal. It's our dream space. It has been stolen and we want it back. We want to reclaim it via rest. And I really resonate with that quote a lot because In order for us to be cycle breakers, in order for us to reclaim our mental health, for us to not perpetuate violence, we need to be able to heal ourselves. And so if we were to be able to do this, then we could then create and dream up these systemic solutions that go beyond what we've been socialized to think that we are only capable of. So that's what I was thinking about. So thank you so much for this beautiful question, Tarm.
Thank you, Grace, for naming all that. So when I interpreted this question, I thought of it in like an individual context. And for me, I learned that one way to combat, the cycle of violence is through male engagement programs, like at least in the work that I've done with engaging men. I feel like there's been a lot of traction and a lot of great work in integrating male engagement strategies and degendering anti-sexual violence, sexual harassment work. But I also think that there can be a lot more intentionality in addressing mental health support, specifically for men and masculine folks. Another thing that this made me think about is having conversations around men who do this work, and also for male survivors of sexual violence, sexual harassment. I think oftentimes when we talk about men who do this work, I think there's this like hyper glorification of these men who happen to be doing anti-sexual violence, sexual harassment work, because I do feel there's a tendency for people to be like, oh my God, wow, you're such a great man for doing this work, even though that should be like considered the bare minimum. There's again, this tendency to hyper glorify this work. As a man or as a masculine presenting person. And so I think, yes, involving men as leaders in this work is extremely important. And also we should also be really critical in how we are, I guess, exemplifying the work of men who are doing this work at sometimes bare minimum levels versus people who have been doing this work for a really long time and happen to not be men. And I also think it's important that we are addressing the internal violence that men hold for themselves and what society is expecting of men. And then men and we collectively as a society are upholding very rigid gender expectations that confine men to very harmful and limiting gender norms. And all of these collective expectations ultimately limit men's capacity to live to their full potential because they aren't given the spaces to express their emotions in a really healthy way. Being able to cry, go to therapy. They're allowed to express anger because that's something that is traditionally acceptable because, it's an act of aggression, right? And they're often told their whole lives that they just got to tough it out, which is so telling that so many men are not receiving full mental health diagnoses, yet suicide rates among men are higher than of women, right? So, being mindful about how our services are, not catered to what we typically expect a survivor looks like, because as we know, survivors are vast in their experiences and their identity. And so, just being not having this expectation of what a good survivor looks like or what any survivor should look like.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts. And I really appreciate, again, like really bringing in not only like the individual looking at how to break cycles of violence, like within like the individual level, but then also like looking at like the systemic cultural level as well, because especially when it comes to forms of like different like assault and like violence as well, it's very easy for people to be able to like see this as like very isolated events, right? Like isolated events, like only focusing on the individual person, right? Focusing on kind of like that reactive response type of care. But when it comes to cycles of violence, and as well as, engaging in preventative measures, these are really larger structures that we need to be like thinking about as well, that people like forget about. So thank you so much for touching on all these like different, again, like systemic as well, like individual and interpersonal levels as well. So let's go ahead and go into our next question. So how does sexual violence prevention connect with the larger needs of supporting and advocating for historically oppressed communities that feed into like concepts and like movements such as gender affirming care, housing and food security or insecurity, policy changes, as well as restorative justice as well?
I can kick us off this time. I always feel like sexual violence prevention is inherently connected to supporting and advocating for historically oppressed communities. And and the reality is that sexual violence is often used as a tool of repression and control. And so when we are expanding that view of sexual violence more than just kind of thinking about this like individual level of like using sex as a way to X, Y, and Z, but we really kind of think about what are the historical narratives around sexual violence that have been used against specifically, for example, Indigenous communities or Black women, right? And thinking about how that has been used as a tool of oppression and control. There's no way to essentially not connect the dots to think about how sexual violence prevention must be connected to other issues as well, because it has been used on a systemic level to really be as a tool for oppression and control against marginalized communities, right? And so that's why when I think about thinking about sexual violence prevention, we can't necessarily think about it as a way of like, okay, if I just stop sexual violence, then that's the end all be all, right? Because that is kind of like thinking about how I'm in a sinking boat and I have all these different holes, but I'm only going to focus on that one hole of my sinking boat, right? Because regardless, your boat is going to be sinking. So why would I be focusing on that one hole, right? I need to think about how do I patch up the entire boat so that we can be able to float and thrive here, right? And so when I think about how the work that we do as sexual violence prevention educators, we must always bring in the conversation around systems of oppression, racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, and how those issues contribute to higher rates of sexual harassment, assault, abuse against communities that are systemically marginalized. It's no accident, right? And it's no accident that these rates have not changed, right? And it's no accident that these narratives are silenced. It's no accident that these narratives are erased, and there's no accident that very much the stereotypical image of a survivor is a white cis hetero woman. These are not accidents, right? And so when we think about sexual violence prevention, we have to name these specific dynamics in order to be able to acknowledge, to create solutions to actually address them from a systemic level and think about how do we patch up the entire boat and not just focus on that one hole.
I can go next if that's okay, Bella. Cool. So there's been a lot of there's been such a lack of investment, like monetarily, like federally, and even in locally in prevention specifically. And it seems even institutionally, the work that's being put in for prevention is not necessarily recognized by institutions because it's really difficult to track deliverables, right? So like the rates of which staff are compiling data or creating presentations or having events, all of that labor is not really taken into account. And so it's not really seen as given really that quantitative data that it seems that a lot of institutions are looking for. And since there's not as much support for prevention as there is for intervention services, for example, it essentially means that we're prioritizing people getting harmed versus addressing the roots of violence, which we know come from white supremacy, anti-Blackness, ableism, homophobia, etc. And for me, part of sexual violence prevention is providing survivors with truly trauma-informed and anti-carceral approaches to addressing harm. And a lot of times survivors, especially survivors of color and other minoritized communities, do not want to navigate traditional punitive processes for harm. They just want the person who caused harm to stop, learn, and correct their behavior and never cause harm again. And so restorative justice is one potential alternative to traditional punitive reporting processes that can, rebuild communities and relationships and work through unlearning, right, these harmful behaviors. And our society teaches us to cause and perpetuate harm in a variety of different ways. And so it's really naive of us to assume that all people have the same amount of access that we have had to unlearn harmful social norms. And people are also deserving of unlearning these harms and learning how to not cause harm, just like how we, got these opportunities and, being in these spaces, getting to be in community with other people, right? But yeah.
I love those two answers. So very with that kind of solution mindset and focusing on the systemic issues that really intersect with our space of anti-sexual violence. I really appreciate that. And also the boat image, I think that's really powerful to think about. When I think about these intersection between the various advocacy groups and needs, My mind kind of goes to the dim sum or yum cha experience. I know Grace, we had talked a little bit about this before, and that's so central to our cultures, to just be in communion with one another. And I think that visualization is so beautiful and applicable here in the survivor resource space when I start to think about shifting mindsets, pairing with the solutions that we're talking about. And so thinking about all the different dishes that are being brought together, the different teas that are brought together, and we're all sitting here, in a circle as one, to collectively nourish our different bodies in different ways. And that's, I think, similar to the acknowledgement and advocacy of many different kinds of resources to serve the wants and needs of different individuals and different communities, and acknowledging, as to Andrew said, those different access issues too, right? Because there really is no one size fits all model for anyone. And that acknowledgement is the first step in extending compassion and understanding, as an individual and then as a community. And at the policy level, and something that we at EBC continue to work to pass our memorandums of understanding, or collaborations with different affinity or cultural organizations to work together to serve the needs of survivors. So just as an example, you might think of, there's a university, say in Texas, Texas Muslim Women's Foundation is coming to mind because we had a conversation with them recently, but they've been outreaching to universities in their areas to say, we're here if you need us. And we want to form this partnership to make sure that if you're not getting the resources that you need on your campus, we are also available. And so making that widespread at the state level to make sure that there are people on and off campus for you. They exist, and we just have to make them accessible and aware that they're there.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. To me, I feel like what kind of stands out from what all of you have shared so far is that it is just undeniable that sexual violence and just cycles of violence in general really intersects and is super connected to all these different structural and cultural systems as well. And kind of maybe a part two type of question to this. So, since we're all in this work, right? We're all in this work of supporting survivors, and we understand the importance of prevention work. But why does it take so long for people to, I guess, kind of believe in prevention work and to really get it off the ground when it still seems again, there's just a lot of focus on that kind of reactive or responsive intervention. Well, of course, it is really important, but also, there's been research and data that's been gathered that prevention is what's needed. So why is there such kind of a mismatch when it comes to, I guess, providing those types of services or resources that supports prevention?
I can start. This is a very loaded question, Tarm. I feel very specific way about it. But as a person that has done prevention education for a while now, I definitely have seen the ebbs and flows of kind of federal legislation and the focuses on college campuses and where funding definitely gets kind of sourced into. And I think that there is a very long answer to this, but I think that my short response is that it takes a lot more effort, honestly, to be able to do prevention work, right? And it's very difficult to essentially kind of say that these things that we're doing are very effective because we're preventing harm from actually happening, right? And so it's all after the fact, and then we are coming in, right? And so sometimes measuring something can be a little bit more difficult to be able to kind of translate into what people are kind of seeing as what metrics of success might look like, right? And so for me, I have had to kind of need to expand what the metrics for success look like, because it's difficult to essentially say violence has decreased, from 1 year to another year as that's my metric of success. That is actually a very difficult metric success, because every year is there, as we talked about, violence is interconnected with a lot of different things, right? And so I can't necessarily say that my specific educational intervention meant that then that's what happened. Violence was decreased all around campus or all around all their places, because it takes a whole village, it takes a whole community, right? And so what I've had to kind of reformat is what are the metrics of success, right? And one specific metric is that, like, are people having caring relationships? Are they actively engaging in their sexual citizenship in the way that they actually want to, right? As opposed to just thinking about violence prevention and just thinking about ending violence as the end goal. I actually want to swim a little bit more upstream and think about, like, how do people understand themselves as sexual beings, and how do they understand their own boundaries? How do they understand how to communicate what those boundaries are, and are they able to do that, right? Because that actually will be preventing sexual violence from occurring, right? And so the challenge is trying to connect the dots for folks, is to help them understand that sometimes when I'm speaking about, doing workshops about creating caring relationships, that directly connects to violence prevention, and this is how and why, right? Versus I'm going to read off the definition of what sexual violence is, and that is essentially the educational intervention that I'm expected to be doing sometimes, because then people know what sexual violence is, right? But we can't start off with just sexual violence as what people should know, because if they only know what sexual violence is and they don't know how to actually the antidote for sexual violence, then we're not preventing anything in the first place. So that was my longer kind of little bit unwieldy spiel, but that was what I was kind of thinking about.
Okay, I can go. I can see us looking at each other. Yeah, what popped up into my head was thinking about the longevity and momentum building of different movements, right? It is really, really hard to build up a movement and to keep that momentum going for a very long time. And at a certain point, and this is not on the individuals who are trying to advocate for different policies. It's the system itself, and it's this kind of dismissal of, oh, if you're an advocate, then you are supposed to be giving 120% and not taking care of yourself as much, right? And so there's that bigger conversation about what does mental health look like for advocates, and then how does that translate into pushing for policies and pushing for movements to be sustained and to have the impact that we want them to. So the first thing I thought about was burnout, of being one of those barriers on the individual level.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. The burnout is so real. And yeah, I also really resonate with what Grace was talking about with just like the metrics being so hard to navigate in terms of prevention. It's like, yeah, like how are you measuring, right? Obviously, like there's creative ways. I don't have the brain for it to like imagine like how to construct a question that is wondering or that asks, so how is this workshop not, or how did this workshop let you know not to cause harm, or like how is this preventing you from causing harm? And that, it's really challenging. And so I think for me, like one of the ways that I navigate my prevention work is, restorative justice has been extremely helpful, and thinking about it not just as an intervention strategy, but even as a prevention strategy. Because oftentimes when we think about restorative justice, we think about it happening after harm has been, after harm has occurred. But we can learn how to facilitate like an accountability pod, for example, like how to have conversations with community members that we feel, trust with, that we feel community with, to create a mutual understanding about, if I cause harm, I feel the trust in you that you will, hold me accountable and you'll let me know that I caused harm. And then vice versa, right? So like if I cause harm, I want you to let me know. And if you cause harm, like I hope that you trust that I would, let you know that you've caused harm. And so having those conversations in a prevention way, like, or preventatively, can really create, that feeling of, I guess, like less anxiousness around causing harm, and, create or cultivate an environment where people are less likely to cause harm because they know that their community members are going to hold them accountable. And then it also gives tools, or restorative justice can also give folks the tools on how to facilitate their own harm circles for when harm does inevitably occur, right? We're all at capacity to cause harm. We, create harm on a day-to-day basis, right? So once we do cause harm, folks can have the tools to, hold their own circles and create meaningful conversations and reconnect with one another to rebuild those, those connections and relationships that were, harmed in the past. And what can we do to repair those things?
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your responses. And when it comes to this topic, it's prevention work and just like supporting survivors and just even understandings of sexual violence is can be very nuanced. It's definitely not cookie cutter, So I feel like a lot of the times it can some of the pieces that can be missing in conversations around supporting survivors is how do we nurture relationships, right? How do we keep people accountable as well. And I feel like this feeds actually into the next question. And so, what do you feel like are some key actions that we can take to prevent sexual violence?
I can start us off. So I think that I would be really interested in having a lot more conversation about what goes on behind the scenes. I think that many people who do sexual violence, sexual harassment work or anti-sexual violence, sexual harassment work, including myself, happen to be survivors of, sexual violence, sexual harassment. And oftentimes the conditions, bureaucracies, XYZ, are not really interested in the safety, let alone of their clients, but also of their staff members, right? Who happen to be also survivors of violence. And I think in talking about this, I feel that there should be more conversations in addressing this expectation. And this was brought up earlier too, that this work, the normalization or the socialization that we're taught is that this work is overwhelming. It is underpaid, it's underappreciated, and it's difficult, challenging work. And I think a lot about why are we perpetuating this and why are we normalizing this language when it doesn't have to be that way. There's not a lot of investment in integrating vicarious trauma or vicarious trauma release strategies into our work. And I feel like oftentimes we're compliant to harmful institutional policies because at the end of the day, we still operate under a hierarchical capitalistic structure. But I think we can also be more vigilant in our approaches with leadership and those of us who are in leadership to challenge when harm is being caused to the communities that we're serving, and also when there is harm being caused to our staff. And so being a younger person in this field, there are certain assumptions that are made about me that I can't possibly be a leader because I don't have a lot of experience, even though I've done this work for over 8 years. And that's also to say that just because you have a lot of experience in this field and doing this work or have had leadership titles in the past does not mean you're a good leader. You can still cause harm as a leader and have all of these years of experience and have been a leader for a really long time. Yet I think oftentimes that, there's a prioritization of level of academic achievement, accolades, or certain titles that you've held in the past, right? And not necessarily if you have leadership skills that prioritize empathy, inclusivity, empathy, and just caring caring nature to clients, survivors, and staff, teammates.
Yeah, I think that Andrew has gotten me wanting to kind of follow up on some things that in your previous response and also this one too. But I think a lot about how it's very difficult to take accountability in our current structure that is very punitive and really focused on response, right? And in response in a very punitive kind of carceral type of way, right? And so I think that a key action to be able to prevent sexual violence, because we know that people that cause harm are most likely the ones that have also been harmed and also are going to continue to cause harm, even if you expel them, lock them up, et cetera, like removing them from a community or removing them from somewhere. It doesn't necessarily fix the issue at all, right? It's just going to show up in different ways. And that is really what cycles of violence look like, right? Where we essentially kind of ostracize people because of something that they had done. And the something that people have done can be a broad spectrum of things, right? But I truly believe that every person should be able to have the opportunity to be able to have a conversation and have an opportunity to learn and grow. And it's really difficult in our current climate to be able to do that, because we're really quick to shame, we're really quick to cancel, and we're really quick to label people as bad people or good people, right? When in actuality, we're all socialized in the very same system. Some of us had opportunities to reflect and grow. I know I have harmed people, and I know that I have had to reflect and grow as well. And I'm grateful for those opportunities to be able to do that, right? Because now I'm able to do my work as a prevention educator a little bit better, right? And so that's a key action that I would say is really important for us to really be able to think about: how do we make space for people to take accountability in really caring, compassionate ways, as opposed to our gut response, which is to label them, cancel them, shame them, shun them, right? Because in my opinion, I feel like that's sometimes the easier and short-term kind of response. The harder work is probably going to be able to still have this person or people in the community and be able to hold them, to be able to care for them and be able to help them learn and grow if they're willing to do that, right? And so one resource that I wanted to actually recommend too, as Andrew was speaking, was Beyond Survival. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this book, but it's Beyond Survival. And it's strategies and stories from this transformative justice movement. And the book is really featuring a lot of different stories that intersect with sexual violence, and thinking about how do we create more imaginative possibilities around community repair, individual harm, and how do we think beyond this kind of box that we've been put into of how do we actually repair harm and heal and move forward as individuals in a community in a more sustainable and long-term way.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you so much, Andrew and Grace, for sharing those and also sharing another resource. I really appreciate that. I think taking the question in a different direction to key actions we can take to prevent sexual violence. I think at the individual level, it really is about educating ourselves and each other, right? So beyond, what does sexual violence look like? How to be an active bystander? That's all very important. But also, what does a healthy relationship look like, right? Like, what is a healthy relationship? What do healthy boundaries look like? What does advocating for that for yourself as an individual, and then also as a community, what can that look like as well? I think those are really important parts of learning, and then also just as a whole of understanding the other contributors to sexual violence and how we can prevent it as a whole. So there's another account that I was thinking about that actually shows different stories of healthy relationships and healthy boundary setting. And if I find that, I will let you know, and we can share that again later.
Thanks so much, everyone, for all your responses, and also like loving all the different resources that are just like being shared today. We can never get enough resources as well, and especially since, like I mentioned like earlier, like I feel like it's like such a niche like topic as well, and like we also want to be able to like find or like come across different types of resources that really like uplift specific narratives, as well as being able to like capture some of like the nuances as well, which can be difficult to like come across, especially depending on the types of media or like articles or different type of research that we may encounter as well. So I know in everyone's responses, seems like everyone touched a little bit of this, but this is actually going to be our last question. So I wanted to open it up. So what do you think is missing in conversations surrounding sexual violence prevention?
I accidentally clicked my button, and so I take that as a sign. So I think one other thing I would be interested in considering is that I think like being really critical of where our constructions of like, Grace also touched on this earlier, of like who is like a good survivor, and it's usually catered to like white, cis, straight survivors. And like where do like our ideas of these things come from? And so I think like just really challenging and understanding that where where the roots of like just even things like social work come from. Even VAWA, being part of the crime bill, which incarcerated a lot of Black and brown folks. Obviously VAWA has created like a lot of protections for survivors, but it's also part of a very carceral piece of legislation. And so being really critical about like what and how services and resources for survivors are looking like, and are they tied to punitive measures? Are they tied to thinking about like what accountability looks like and what justice looks like, and like what and how we are creating messages for survivors that are giving folks the option to identify like what accountability and justice means for them. Because I feel like oftentimes institutions, organizations, even if it's like subconsciously, are telling survivors, oh, in order for you to receive justice, the person who caused harm to you needs to be incarcerated, or this person needs to do XYZ, or needs to go through whatever same amount of pain that you have experienced, or something similar to the pain that you've experienced, rather than what are the teachable moments so that this person does no longer causes harm. Because again, as we know, like a lot of times the people who cause harm to someone are usually people that right? So it's not necessarily that you want to break that relationship with a person, it's that you no longer want them to cause you harm. And so, just like Grace mentioned also too, is that offering people the grace to be able to the grace offering grace to people who didn't have access to the same resources, or teachable moments for people to no longer engage in harmful behaviors.
Yeah, that's really important. I could just jump in, and thank you for mentioning the part about incarceration too, about most people not wanting to confront that or go through that process. And in campus sexual violence, we think about reporting, right? A lot of resources are tied to reporting, even though 90% of survivors are not going to report, right? And that could be for reasons of fear of retaliation, for breaking a school code of conduct. And sometimes those code of conducts can be, not necessarily reasonable. Other times it could be, fear of not being believed, or just not wanting to go through the process because it is a hefty process to go through. There's a lot of consideration involved in that. And so making sure that when we're talking about prevention and response, and again, to Andrew's point about what justice looks like, why does it need to be tied to a reporting process, right? Why does someone have to go through that to receive basic care? And so I think that is one thing that we're continually trying to insert into conversations. And again, Andrew, you mentioned this too, of also having young people not really be in the spaces where decisions are being made. And a lot of young people are advocating for, hey, I do need resources, or if something were to happen to me or something were to happen to my friend, I want them to be able to access things. And having those voices be dismissed has been very detrimental, especially since these are the people who are affected most and who are affected now. Right. So I think making sure that young people are involved in these conversations, making sure that we know there are different paths to justice. And then beyond that, looking at the framework of what violence looks like and who violence affects. To Grace's point, I think there does need to be more conversation about what does the history of sexual violence look like and advocacy look like for survivors of color? Because really, when we're thinking about advocacy, there has been a lot of advocacy by Black women, by Asian women, and by men as well, and that has not been told to us. And when you only see a certain group of people working in these spaces, you start to get the impression that not only do survivors look one way, but the people that I can go to for help look one way. And those people might not understand the experiences or the nuances or my cultural or language needs. And that could be very detrimental too to blocking resources, right? And so I think those are all in the mesh of needs, as well as going back to the idea that mental health for advocates should exist, that we deserve to be cared for and paid. And all of those mesh together. So I think I'll pass it to Grace. Yeah.
Those were all so beautiful. I see so many positive affirmations going all around. It makes my heart so happy. I think the only thing I'll add to this really rich dialogue that all of my colleagues are having right now is that what comes to mind is cultural betrayal trauma. And this is a framework that was coined by Jessica Gomez, and kind of thinking about how does harm happen amongst the same community. And that kind of adds another layer of trauma, right? And I think that when I think about the current solutions that are very based in, carceral and punitive measures, these specific responses were not thought about in terms of what happens within like intra-community harm, right? And what do we do with that, right? Because a lot of times folks within the same community are not going to want to use those same kind of punitive type of responses because they're part of the same community, right? And it's really difficult to be able to find other type of solutions to be able to address the harm that occurred then if they don't necessarily go through a punitive type of system. So then it becomes a cyclical cycle where they are then silenced. The person or people are continuing to perpetuate harm. There's divisions in community, and then generations continue to perpetuate more and more harm to others, right? And so what I think about a lot is like, how do we come up with really community oriented solutions, really coming from the community itself to be able to address the harm and repair the harm and be able to heal and move forward and prevent it, right? And so a lot of these conversations that are currently missing are really coming, are really because we're omitting people that are actually on the ground, we know in reality that sexual violence prevention, the entire movement really started with Black women. And we currently have overwhelming majority of our prevention movement, or essentially the institutionalized prevention movement, is very white women centric, right? And so it's important to see that these things are not on accident, and the reason now that we have a lot of these type of responses that are grounded in a lot of punitive measures that don't necessarily reflect the lived experiences of communities, a lot of times communities of color, is because of the ways that we've kind of omitted those type of responses or those type of perspectives. And a lot of times the reason why people don't come from those communities to access resources is because unfortunately the cultural betrayal trauma and the intra-community betrayal and harm continues to occur. And that is because of so many generations and historical and collective societal trauma that continues to be inflicted. So that's what I would add for the food for thought.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. So this actually concludes this session. So I just want to send lots of love and lots of thanks to Andrew, Bella, and Grace for being here today. One of the things that I just really love about being able to, co-host the Survivor Support Summit is to be able to learn from our amazing speakers, from all of you. I know I've learned so much, and I really also hope that people who are watching from YouTube, which I think also the stream will also be saved on our YouTube channel as well, that when people watch back, that it also challenges maybe some of their assumptions or biases that they have, because especially hearing from folks like all of you who are doing the work with survivors, and just being able to really expand people's mind to unlearn, re-educate, and also reimagine different ways of being able to support survivors, also to challenge the systems, and not only just challenge the systems, but really freaking interrogate the systems, and to really make these systemic changes. So thank you so much for being here today. So for those who are waiting for the next session, that's going to be starting in a little bit less than 5 minutes. So that's going to be the 2 p.m. PST session /5 p.m. EST. And the topic is going to be a conversation on identity and intimacy. So thanks so much, everyone. And hopefully,